Assalamu alaikum. Tēnā koe, te lofa lava, nā mihi mahana kia koto katoa. So it's tremendous to be here. As you know, we've had an inquiry, and I'm going to take you through the 216 pages of the report over the next few minutes. My life changed, and the life of the 6 of us on the panel changed last year when we were given the great honour and the great responsibility of undertaking this inquiry on behalf of the people of Aotearoa. We were appointed to start on the 31st of January. We were given 9 months. We had a 1-month extension. Some people had the cheek to say to me, "Oh, you need an extra month." It was a huge job. It was a really huge job. And we were able to do it because of you, because of all the people in this room, the people around the country, the people listening in, so many people with lived experience, Pari whānau and others who came to us. But it was a hard job. I want to acknowledge in particular our rangatira, Matua Mason, who is with us in spirit today, but probably tilling his garden up there in Fielding, and my colleague at the University of Auckland, that's where this photograph is taken, Jemima Tia Seat, standing there by me. She's pretty busy being the head of Māori and Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland. But when I was asked to speak, I said, we don't do things as a one-sim in this panel. If there are panel members there, they're going to be up there with me. And so we'll be sharing this presentation. So we did the job, and it was a big job. And I think you're all familiar with the very wide terms of reference. In essence, there were 3 parts to what we had to do. The first was to go out there and hear the voices of the people. We heard them face to face. We heard them through social media. We heard them, of course, through the 5,200 submissions that we had. And we'll talk a bit more about that process in a moment. 1, hear the voices. 2, report on how we're doing. A stock take of how New Zealand is doing. And although a lot of work had been done already, we commissioned work from the University of Otago to inform that, because we needed to get a clear picture of how we're doing compared with where we were and where we want to be. And then, of course, our third job was to report with recommendations to the government. The Victorians are just setting up a Royal Commission to Mental Health, and I'm going over there to meet with the Royal Commissioners the week after next. But I was looking at the other big Royal Commission into family violence, and they came up with 237 recommendations. So just be grateful we only came up with 40. We came up with a lot, as you know, and it's a big and meaty report, and it needed to be, because the issues that we're dealing with, the issues that we were facing as a country, were so broad. So what I'd like to do now is to pass over to my loved brother in arms, Dean Rangihuna, just to give you a bit of a flavour of how we went about the job, and then we're going to take you through the recommendations, sharing that, and then just a little bit of closing thoughts. So, kia ora, Dean.
Nā mihi ki o koutou e karau rangatira, ki ngā iwi whānau hapu o te motu, a tēnā rā koutou katoa. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Muslim family and whānau from Otatahi, from Christchurch. And I know that colleagues of mine that are here today, Tony, Disley, Kay and Deborah from the CDHB, have been working with those families and whānau. And I'm actually going to talk about the CHB and how they've valued my role as someone with lived experience later on. Not going past Will and the team from Te Pau and Mātuaraki, the Riri Centre and Mātuaraki. And when I talk about Mātuaraki, I can't help but think about He Waka Ika Noa. They touched me, they moved me. And that's what worked for them in their recovery. And Will mentioned very connected to the process, and I believe our values in terms of aroha, whanaungatanga, kotahitanga, whakamā, and mahitai, and tūmanako pai, is what we lived and breathed. And we did that as we went across the country. We did that with a commitment and a passion to listen to the people's voices, and that's exactly what we did. And when we're talking about leading sustainable change, it is a journey through changes. And I kind of reflect back on my time with Odyssey House, because that's what Odyssey kind of helped me, and in many ways. And that I guess when we look at underpinning our values, which will be very interaction and very conversational, and all what we do as we went around the country was humbling and honouring. Because one man said this to us, and it was Ken Mason: go and listen to the people's voices. This wasn't about us. And so as we travel across the country, there was voices of pain, voices of sorrow, but mainly of voices wanting change. That's it, koutou.
We're having to come up with all of this as we go, and so we had to come up with a plan that would get us the direction we needed to take, and then bring the people, bring you all who are doing the work with us. And so we knew what would work, and these are the things that we knew would work. And so this is, as has been mentioned, this is how we did it. So we said, let's just be open to any and all ways anyone would like to submit to us. One of the most beautiful ways was a video submission that we got that included a song. It was by a staff member of Odyssey House. And what he had done is created, I should just play it later in the day, maybe we will. But it pretty much just talked about how all of us together are the different parts of this change that we want to see. And that was what it was across all of these submissions, you know, the beautiful parts of Taonga that built this broader picture of what the future could be. And yeah, we met with people face to face. We had over 400 meetings. And it was hard. It was very hard. And it was hard to sit there for 12 hours and listen to bereaved families and others every day. But that's what needed to happen. And that's what we must all do, as you were doing. Continue to spend that time. These are some of the places that we went. They were particularly meaningful. All of them were meaningful, but these particular moments stood out. Where Mary O'Hagan handed over the Wellbeing manifesto that many of your organisations were part of delivering to us. Where Dean received this submission from one consumer leader to another. We were with the PSA in Auckland, and they talked to us about the importance of bringing the workforce. One of the submissions in one of the quotes in the report is, all the dreams of the inquiry will come to naught if you do not bring the workforce with you. And they really highlighted that for us. This is Ron and our team at St. John's College in Hastings. They're a school where they've partnered with the local corrections department to do work with young people in the prison for a social enterprise. They've also partnered with the local mental health trust to build empathy for the family members who are having a really hard time, and for the students to then better work with them. This is us at Te Reo Matatini, Te Reo Ora, up in Auckland, who brought together iwi leaders. This was us when we visited some of the young people in prison. Those were some of the submissions that stood out to us most. They really wanted to know, is my voice worthwhile? It was really hard listening to them talk about how the social determinants are the reason that they're in prison. And we say that in the report. This meeting here was particularly tough. This was at home in Christchurch, where the brokenness of what we thought would be talking about the earthquake ended up talking about the facilities and some of the access challenges. But I guess that's just a bit of a scope of some of what we heard. You can read the 216 pages if you'd like to see the rest.
I know I'm supposed to be doing the talk, but at this point I'm actually handing over to Barb, who's just going to frame for us how we went about pulling together all we heard and then taking us through the recommendations. Barb, over to you.
Kia ora, thanks, Ron. ena reo, ena mana, ena iwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So there were a number of principles that framed our response to what we heard. And as you've heard us say a number of times, we really did want in our report to honour the voices of the people that we'd heard. One of the key principles that guided the response in our report was that everything that we wanted to see going forward would be framed by a treaty framework response. And that linked to that, we would have a very strong equity lens across everything that happens in mental health. And if you don't think that'll lead to change, just think about what that would actually mean. They were the key and one of the first principles in our recommendations. The next was that we would be guided by the people, and we've talked about that, and not by the preferences of the system. That there would be shared responsibility, and that shared responsibility would sit with every one of us across the sector, every single one of us. There is not one person who's going to be able to lead the change or do the change. So we all have to think about that. So it's a shared responsibility. It's not a health responsibility alone. It's not a secondary services responsibility. It is a much wider responsibility. We also wanted to build on the foundations that were in place because we saw some amazing things as we went across our country, some amazingly innovative things in pockets working across our country. So we're not starting with a clean slate or one that we have to undo. We had to find the underlying reasons. One of the things we came back to in our deliberations is why has there not been change when so many people had a consensus around what needed to change? And so there's some deep thinking about what are the barriers to our implementation dysfunction, because we actually have it, right? Shifting is not what we're good at. And so removing the roadblocks and looking at those and looking at how we get fundamental systemic change is what we need to do. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Josiah. The main difference that emerged during this inquiry is the striking degree of consensus that we found right across the country and in different parts of the system about the need to change in a new direction. There was a big, strong emphasis on wellbeing that pervaded everything, with more prevention, more early intervention, expanded access to services, more treatment options, services closer to home, whānau and community-based responses, and cross-government action were all parts of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to put across. So given that degree of consensus, we also asked ourselves why this hadn't happened and why we had the system that we've got. And frankly, back in 1996, when Ken Mason did do that first inquiry, he actually focused on the 3% who were not getting services. And it's important that we remember that. So we've got the response that we needed at the time, which was to do better by the people who were most seriously disadvantaged by our current lack of services. We now are in a position where we've done that, and so how do we move to address the bigger and wider issues that continue to present? So we came up, as you know, with 10 main recommendations. The first of these was to expand access and choice, offer more to people who need it. We're currently supporting across the country 3.7% of people, primarily in secondary services, and the people who have the highest levels of need. So access for this group does have to remain a priority, but we need to start marching towards the 20% of people who now have their lives impacted as a result of a mental health and drug or alcohol challenge. And still, those people are fighting for access. So we referred to them as the missing middle, and we need to set and fund a new target for this. This new target will not be based on more of the old or more of secondary extended out into primary. It will be us seriously looking at how do we transform our systems and get a very different evidence-based approach that builds on whānau approaches within our communities, that also has greater access to talk therapies, alcohol and drug services, and culturally informed and aligned services. So it's about moving things into the community and doing things quite differently. The second thing was to transform primary healthcare, and we've talked a little bit about that. So we need skilled, accessible and integrated primary healthcare in its broadest sense, not primary healthcare in its narrowest GP sense, services that are essential for responding to and preventing mental health and addiction problems. So we made a number of recommendations there, and we're talking about how do we actually get the services we need into a much bigger space, closer to people, in their homes, in the communities where people naturally go. Strengthening the NGO sector. Again, one of the big issues we found was that the NGO sector still struggles, and in many parts. So NGO for us includes Kaupapa Māori, Pacifica-specific peer services, and it's really important that we look at how we lift those up. There was a lack of genuine partnership with government experienced by many of the NGOs, funding insecurities, high compliance costs, poor training, and professional development channels. So we need a committed approach by government that looks at the wealth and the strength that exists across our communities and has somewhere clear responsibility for stewardship of those. The fourth recommendation umbrellaed a whole lot of things around enhanced wellbeing, promotion and prevention, and that's about dealing with the social determinants of health that influence much broader our social wellbeing. Multiple agencies are responsible for that, and we need to have very clear targets around outcomes there so that we are looking at the locus of government responsibility for social wellbeing. And we're beginning to see some signs of that with the measuring of child wellbeing along with our economic wellbeing. So we need a real investment in an approach that does that. The fifth one is over to Dean. And so, Dean, would you like to come back up and talk about that one? Thank you, everybody.
And I forgot to mention Robin and Ashley here, so ngā mihi kia korua. And for me, I said that I was going to talk about the CDHB because it pertains to the recommendations of 2021. My service has wrapped around their korowai, their cloak of care, with immense support, so I'm able to do the things that I need to do as a consumer leader. That's happened for me from day dot, and I've been with my service for coming up 15 years. So I'd like to mihi to all my esteemed leaders from Canterbury for all the tautoko and the care that they've given me around that. But for us as consumers, we want to feel valued. We want to feel included. You talk about partnership and participation for us as consumer leaders, but at what level? Where we should be. And I know that those are discussions that Robin and Ashley have instigated between Balance Aotearoa and the Coalition. And I was part of that as well after the inquiry, and it was great to see. So I'd like to acknowledge Robin and the work that the team are doing there as well. For me too, no more of being bounced from an alcohol and drug service or mental health service. And the need to actually work together in collaboration and in partnership so that we can participate along all those services as well as our consumers. It's been going on for far too long. And the other thing is that I feel like I'm an old hand at this, but I feel that we need to acknowledge our emerging consumer leaders, those who have been journeying through the services of late. I'm not knocking the ones who have had a great experience in providing advocacy and support for those voices, those consumer voices, but the need for succession planning within the consumer movement. And to need to ensure that we honour those voices because we are all the same. And we should not be excluded from participating at leadership levels. So for me, being here today, I thank my DHB for allowing me to come here, also for paying my pain fee as well. But they're my family. They've shown me and given me hope. It makes it worthwhile being a champion for the consumer voices, because I tell you what, there's some voices we did not hear from. What are those voices? Those are those hard to reach voices. Those are those ones that found it hard to come to the table. Those are the ones that found it hard to come to the public meetings. Let us not forget them. Let us look at how we might attract them to come to the table, or find ways and means so that we can too hear their voices. And so I acknowledge my consumer tangata whāora, the leaders from the past, but also in the present. Because right now, many people get services they do not meet their needs. They find it hard to navigate the system, are on a peripheral of service design and delivery. And I hear a word, co-design. Well, when I look at co-design, where is the consumer voice? The question that I have is that, should we be leading it as consumer leaders in the co-design process? Well, yes, we should. I'm not being pushy. It's just that I hear from a consumer voice tirelessly over the last 14 years about them not being included, about them not having the ability to participate in partnership for the protection of our consumer rights. Nothing about us without us. That's what we say. And connected to that, as families and whānau are crucial, because I believe consumers and families are one. It should not be talked about separately. And I'm just going to read this quote. I know it's up there, but hopefully it'll sink in. The patient is not treated as a whole, but a fragment of the area expertise the particular doctor is trained in. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Possibly one of the hardest areas, and when we came to face, again, I'm not, no. There we go. Possibly one of the hardest areas when, and this was in the commentary at the start, was this panel is mental health and addiction. How can you get them both? How can you get them both in there? How can you unpack all of those challenges? And so we did it as best as we could, and we looked at the most prevailing addictions challenges. And we saw that alcohol was underlining most of the challenges that we have in society. And there hasn't been the political will willing to move on alcohol. The lobbying is too strong, and we consistently, it's the voice in the corner of the room. We called through this based on what the community told us, that this was destroying communities, up there with methamphetamine, that we have to take stronger response. We have to listen to the Law Commission and others who have implored us in the past. That, as this quote says, it's not a war on drugs, it's a war on sick people. We have to take a health approach to this. Our approach is the right approach. That we need to get rid of sanctions for possession of personal use of controlled drugs and other things which make it easier for people to engage with us instead of being pushed away. And that we need a clear home to lead this from inside government. Difficult challenges in this area. And in it, we also talk about the other addictions needs that there are, and we hint at gambling and pornography, e-addiction, and there's recently been the report from the UK, from the Social Media Select Committee, Youth Social Media Use Select Committee review, So all those new pieces of evidence, we're really hoping get used as well. The other area I'm just going to talk briefly about is suicide prevention. So this was possibly the most painful area. I remember meeting with a family in Auckland who had lost four siblings from their family. It seemed everyone in New Zealand wanted to talk to us about suicide, that someone that they knew, that someone they'd worked with. I'm sure most of us in this room know of many people who have taken their lives. And the number one thing I hear in my ears still now is the hopelessness around it and people not feeling that it can change. And so we kind of looked at why is that, and a couple of things. We said that we don't have the cross-party leadership we need on suicide prevention. Right now, it's a political football, and it can't be. We're talking about people who've lost the will to live. We've talked about needing a home in government which can connect us all and everyone who's doing suicide prevention. That the strategy needs to get going. It's been sitting dormant for too long. And that we should have a 20% reduction aspirational 20% reduction in suicide by 2030, giving the government a little bit of time to get ready for it, but then also so that all of us who are involved in suicide prevention, that's every single person in New Zealand, can get on board, because we know that government alone can't do it. That's those two areas. Kia ora.
So how are we doing for time there, Joe? Right, so we're going to move pretty quickly. So I'm going to just cover the next three recommendations. This one says reform. Well, actually what we say is repeal, but we do also say replace. There's been a lot of talk about this. There's been a lot of talk about the need for consistency with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to move to a supported decision-making model. This is hard stuff, and it's a hard policy and legislative challenge, but it needs to happen. And we've been very clear about that in the report, and we've obviously talked about the high rates of seclusion and restraint, particularly against Māori and Pacific people, and that needs to change. That work needs to happen now. We also talk about the need for a new mental health and wellbeing commissioner. We had the first mental health commissioner in front of us just a few moments ago, and so many of you said that there has been a lack of leadership, there has been a lack of a watchdog in the system. This is not to be critical of the current mental health commissioner, but just to recognise that the functions were watered down. Of course, Ken Mason, originally the inquiry from 1996, had envisaged that it would be time limited. But it's become clear that we need to build into our system design a body that is set up by legislation that has specific functions of monitoring and reporting publicly, including in 1 year from the date of the government's response to the inquiry, which has just been delayed until the second half of next month, understandably. That's a really important function in our system, and also roles around monitoring, quality assurance. I won't go into the detail because you've read it for yourselves. Finally, we talked about some of the wider issues and challenges, and so included in there was the issues that we needed to refer to the health and disability sector review. This wasn't just kicking for touch. We didn't know, any more than anyone in this room knew, that there was about to be a much broader review that was going to look, amongst other things, at the roles of district health boards. And we heard very loud and clear the dissatisfaction within the sector, notwithstanding the hard work that people in DHBs are doing with the way things are currently configured, the need to get on with the primary healthcare transformation that hasn't been happening. And we'd heard very, very loud and clear from Māori that we need a completely new way of doing things. And that those possibilities which we refer to are a Māori ministry, or a separate Māori Health Commission, a Māori Commission for Health. And so those issues we properly referred to the Health and Disability Sector Review. But we also, and Josiah used those words, political football, we said it's time for the MPs to come together on some of these issues that we as a people don't want to see these things being used as a football. And indeed, in that section of the report, and I was pointing out this to Josiah this morning, he'd forgotten that this was there at the very end, the last page before the appendices. Kua takato te manaka. The challenge has been laid. This was a very special moment for us because we were taking the voices of the people. We were handing over the report to the Minister of Health, to the government, and in case you're wondering, that's the Parliamentary Library, a beautiful building. We wanted to do that in a dignified and honoured way. I want just in closing to move to our last slide, Joe, just to share these words with you. When love is given, aroha mai, aroha atu, love is returned. I want to acknowledge again how much you all shared with us, how supported we felt through this process. And I want to both acknowledge that and encourage you to take the work forward. Because in my very first communication in March a year ago, I said, this inquiry must not stop the work that's happening already. And so too, this inquiry, the further delay in the response must not stop what needs to happen now. The change that we're all that we're going to be talking about today. When people say, we're having more reviews, nonsense. The report, what you told us was that you, the people, wanted the opportunity to actually spell out what needs to happen, as Dean has just said, the people with lived experience in particular. And so that work is happening. It's happening today. Let's take the ball and get on with it. Just in closing, can my fellow panellists join us? And Dean. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te hangi mai e, tato e.
Meaning give us the love, the faith, the peace to us all here today. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Stay here, Tim. Stay here. Stay here. If you want to take a seat over here and we'll bring the mic over. Yeah. 1, 2. 1, 2. There we go. I'll pass this to you, Ron. So now it's question time. Well, great. We've got one question there. Just while you're all mulling it over, I just thought, Ron, would you reflect on it for us? What's the most difficult change you've led, whether there was the inquiry or something else, and how did you get through it?
I spent 10 years as the Health and Disability Commissioner, as some of you know. I hope I never wrote you a letter. And, and in that role, my background was as a law professor, and doctors especially, they love to get you in a room and bait you. And I can do that stuff. I went to Oxford, I know how to debate. I know how to fight back with all the intellectual arguments. And after several years, and we had this wonderful system, I knew on paper that we had a system where you couldn't sue and you didn't prosecute, and we dealt with complaints in a low-level way. But I realised that for the change that needed to happen, it had to come from hearts, not minds, and I needed to change the way I approached it. And I thought, do I have to really do this touchy-feely stuff? And actually, that made a world of difference. When I started going out there as Commissioner with aroha, with realising that everybody who was working in the system, we all go there to try and make a difference. It really, it changed both, it changed me, it changed our organisation, and I'd like to think it changed the way the sector responded. So yeah, that's the one that I think of.
Thanks. There was a question over here. While you're coming, would you bring the mic over to John? Barbara, did you want to talk to us a little bit about the changes that you've led, and I guess how you get to the end when they might seem insurmountable?
Thanks, Josiah. I guess I can really probably pull on my experience in the Mental Health Commission, and I think at times when you're when change is happening and you're leading change, one of the big things is to keep your goal on where you need to be going, keep your eye ahead, engage people, bring people along with you. and basically build a movement for change. And we talked a lot about how do you keep going when things don't seem to be going anywhere? And everybody in this room's in that space. And I guess for me, it's also about looking back and looking where you have come from and looking at the change. And I think if we do that collectively in this room and think about where things were once, where they now are, yes, we're frustrated, we need more change, but now it's a whole different change. We've got a much more aware community, we've got a much more engaged community, people understand issues around mental health and drug and alcohol challenges more than they did. So how do we now galvanise that action and build forward and keep the momentum and keep the motivation and keep lifting people's spirits?